When I first sat down to watch Fast X 2023, it felt less like pressing play on another film and more like stepping back into a strange, ongoing family gathering. The kind where the stories are wild, the drama is exaggerated, and yet beneath all the noise you recognize is something deeply human. It struck me how long this saga has been with us, how much life has passed since the early days of street races and stolen DVD players, and how it has somehow grown into this sprawling myth that refuses to let go. There's something almost comforting in that familiarity, as though these characters, with all their flaws and exaggerations, have become companions I've grown older with. And yet, the moment the engines roared and the first explosions cracked across the screen, I felt again that strange mix of laughter and awe, the absurdity of what was happening, and at the same time, the sincerity of what it meant. What I love about entering a story like this is the way it mirrors memory itself. We never return the past exactly as it was. We return through fragments, through echoes. The film begins by pulling us back, reminding us of Rio, of a heist that once seemed like a triumph of adrenaline and family loyalty. But here, the past isn't celebration, it's a wound. Suddenly, what once felt like victory becomes a seed of vengeance, a reminder that every act leaves ripples, and sometimes those ripples come back as storms. Watching this, I found myself thinking about the choices we make, the ones we tuck away, convinced they're finished. Yet years later, they resurface, reshaped by the grief of others, demanding a reckoning we thought we'd never have to face. The introduction of Dante is where the film first begins to feel alive in a different way. He isn't presented as just another villain with guns and plans. He enters like theater, like chaos dressed in flamboyance, laughter hiding grief. Jason Momoa leans into the role with a kind of giddy menace that makes you lean forward in your seat, unsure whether to laugh or shudder. And isn't that what real danger often feels like? Not steady, predictable cruelty, but wild unpredictability. He is the embodiment of a wound turned into performance, grief that has learned to laugh, so it doesn't collapse into silence. I watched him taunt, play, destabilize, and I thought of people I have known who mask their pain with excess, who speak too loudly because silence terrifies them, who turn trauma into theater because theater feels safer than honesty. Then comes the chaos of Rome, an ancient city layered with centuries of history, suddenly rattled by an enormous bomb rolling through its streets like a grotesque parody of fate. The absurdity of it all made me smile even as my chest tightened. There was something metaphorical in watching history itself nearly flattened by the weight of vengeance. The cobblestones and monuments stood helpless as Dante turned a modern metropolis into a stage of fire. It felt outrageous, yes, but it also carried a strange poetry. The reminder that no city, no monument, no piece of history is immune to the destructive force of anger. I thought of how our own lives, the things we consider solid and untouchable, can be undone in a moment by forces we didn't see coming. Dom, as always, stands at the center of the storm. He doesn't need many words. His silence carries more than speeches could. In those quiet close-ups, you see not just strength but fear. Fear of losing family. Fear of failing the only people he's ever cared to protect. There's a mythic quality to him now, as though he's no longer man but symbol, yet within that symbol is something deeply human. The vulnerability of a father, watching him fight to save his son, shield him against chaos. I couldn't help but think of the ways we all fight, in quieter ways, to protect the small circles of love in our lives. It is not the car stunts or the explosions that resonate. It is that universal fear of watching what you love slip out of your hands. The crew scatters across the globe, each facing fragments of Dante's plan. Roman and Tej, bickering as ever, sometimes feel like comic relief pushed too far, but beneath their banter is something real, humor as survival. I know that feeling, that impulse to laugh in the middle of fear, to crack a joke when silence feels unbearable. Han, with his haunted calm, moves like a man who has already lived through too many deaths, carrying a quiet melancholy that adds weight to every glance. Letty, fierce and determined, becomes the embodiment of resilience. Her imprisonment and the fight to claw her way back into freedom reminded me of the strength of people I've known who endure without recognition, who carry the weight of battles no one else sees. What's clever in this first half is how the film refuses to give Dom a straightforward enemy. Dante doesn't strike cleanly. He spreads chaos, dismantling security piece by piece. Every victory is immediately undermined by another loss. It's as though Dante is less a man and more a storm, always present, always one step ahead. And in that, I felt the suffocation of inevitability, the sense that no matter how fast you drive, you cannot outrun consequence. That truth weighed on me as I watched the crew struggle, as I saw Dom's stoic facade begin to show cracks. The visual motifs add layers of meaning too. Bridges collapse, roads crumble, highways are torn apart, symbols of bonds breaking, connections failing under strain. Fire consumes cars, reminding us that nothing made by hands can withstand vengeance's appetite. And yet, in the middle of destruction, there are small moments. Dom at a table with his son, Letty glancing back with silent loyalty, Roman laughing through fear. These moments flicker like candles in a storm, fragile but stubborn, insisting that even in chaos, humanity survives. As the first half builds toward its crescendo, the sense of doom becomes overwhelming. Dante isn't simply threatening lives. He's orchestrating despair. Every move is designed not just to wound, but to humiliate, to remind Dom that the past is teeth and that every victory once celebrated carries a shadow. By the time the first half closes, I wasn't left exhilarated by spectacle, but unsettled by inevitability. The ghosts had caught up, and no amount of horsepower could carry them away. And that, I think, is what makes this chapter feel different from the ones before. It doesn't only trade in spectacle, it trades in inevitability, in reckoning. It tells us beneath the fire and the speed that the past never lets go, that vengeance waits as patiently as grief, and that family, no matter how strong, can be undone by the weight of consequence. When I first sat down to watch Fast X 2023, it felt less like going to the cinema and more like stepping into a memory I had been carrying for years. This series has never been just about cars or explosions for me. It has been about time, about how we grow older alongside stories, about how these films, no matter how ridiculous they become, are bound to us because they've been there in the background of our lives. I can remember being younger, laughing at the wildness of a street race under fluorescent lights, or marveling at the sheer audacity of a car soaring across buildings. And now, here we are, decades later, watching the same characters still fight, still drive, still insist on family. There's something almost surreal about it, like meeting an old friend after many years and finding that, despite the gray hairs, despite the weight of time, they're still recognizable, still themselves. But this reunion was different. From the very first frames, I sense an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. The film pulls us back to Rio, to the heist that had once felt like the high point of triumph and camaraderie. Back then, it was a story of victory, of outsmarting a giant. But here, the past is twisted. The heist becomes a ghost, and ghosts are never content to stay buried. That sequence of Rio, once celebrated, is reframed as an open wound. Because while our heroes toasted success, someone else was left behind, shattered, waiting. And that someone is Dante. Jason Momoa's arrival as Dante is the moment the story shifts into something new. He doesn't creep in quietly. He storms in like a force of nature. He laughs too much. He dresses too loudly. He behaves like a man unchained from restraint. At first it feels absurd, but as his motives unfurl, that absurdity hardens into menace. Because what's truly dangerous isn't his flamboyance, it's his grief. He is the son of Hernan Reyes, a ghost from Fast Five, carrying not just a father's death, but years of festering obsession. He doesn't want revenge in the traditional sense. He doesn't want a clean kill. He wants theater. He wants to dismantle Dom's world, not just destroy it. Watching him, I couldn't help but think of how grief can warp a person, how it takes root and grows into something unrecognizable. We like to believe grief fades, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it mutates into vengeance, into chaos dressed as laughter. Then comes Rome, the first major set piece and one of the most outrageous. An enormous bomb, stolen and rolling wildly through the streets of one of the world's oldest cities. Flames licking at monuments, cobblestones rattling under impossible weight, people scattering like ants as a symbol of destruction barrels toward them. It's absurd, yes, but also strangely poetic. Rome is a city that has survived empires, wars, and centuries of upheaval. And yet here it is, threatened not by history, but by vengeance. Watching that bomb careen down the streets, I thought of how fragile even the strongest structures are when chaos is set loose. The sequence made me laugh at its excess, but also unsettled me, because isn't that what vengeance feels like? An unstoppable weight rolling toward us. No matter how solid the ground beneath our feet, Dom, of course, is at the center of it. His stoicism has become legend by now, a man who says little but carries everything. In his silence, you can see the weight of being protector, leader, father. He isn't just a man anymore. He is myth, sculpted by the years of battle behind him. And yet, what makes him human, what makes him resonate, are the cracks in that myth. The way his eyes flicker when his son is threatened. The small moments where his determination is shadowed by fear. That's what touched me most in this first half. The realization that beneath the legend is a father terrified of losing what matters most. I felt it deeply, because beneath all the explosions and chaos, that fear is something we all know. The crew scatters, each facing their own threads of Dante's chaos. Roman and Tej bring their familiar banter, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes comforting, but what struck me is how even in their comedy there's truth. Humor has always been a shield, a way of deflecting fear, when silence would be unbearable. Watching them argue in the middle of danger reminded me of nights with my own friends, when we laughed hardest at the worst times, because laughter was the only way to survive the weight of the moment. Han, always the quiet soul, moves like a man haunted. He has returned from death once before, and that history lingers in his posture, in the way he speaks less but says more. He carries melancholy like a shadow, reminding us that survival doesn't erase scars. It deepens them. Letty, fierce and unyielding, becomes the embodiment of resilience. Her imprisonment, her determination to claw her way back to freedom, mirrors the strength of people I've known who fight battles alone, in silence, away from recognition. Watching her reminded me of the resilience of women who endure not for applause, but because survival is non-negotiable. The first half of the film layers these moments until the atmosphere itself feels suffocating. Dante doesn't attack directly. He dismantles slowly, spreading chaos so that safety no longer exists. Every triumph the crew manages is immediately turned into another loss. Every spark of victory is extinguished by a larger fire. It creates a sense that Dante is not a man but a storm, omnipresent and inevitable. And that inevitability weighed heavily on me. It reminded me of times in life when no matter how hard you fought, the outcome felt preordained, when the past closed in like a trap you couldn't escape. What fascinated me as I watched was how the film used its imagery to underline this theme. Bridges crumbling under cars, highways collapsing into chaos, roads splitting apart. All of it symbolic of bonds breaking, of connections failing under pressure. Fire consumes not just metal but meaning, erasing victories of the past. And yet, in the middle of all this destruction, there are quiet flickers. Dom sharing food with his son, Letty glancing back with loyalty that doesn't need words, Roman laughing through fear. These moments are fragile, but they endure, and in them, the humanity of the story emerges, reminding us that even in storms, small sparks of love and loyalty survive. By the time the first half crescendos, I was left not exhilarated, but unsettled. Dante's plan wasn't about winning quickly. It was about stretching the pain, about ensuring Dom's family lived in despair. And that's where the first half leaves us, with chaos spreading, with bonds tested, with the ghost of Rio now alive and furious. What struck me most wasn't the scale of the spectacle, but the inevitability of it. The reminder that the past is never silent, that grief never disappears, that vengeance waits patiently, and that family, though powerful, can still be undone by consequence. And that is the strange magic of this opening half. Beneath the absurd physics, beneath the roaring engines, lies a story about inevitability, about how no one, not even legends, can outrun the ghosts of their choices. What struck me most as the film shifted into its second half was the way the atmosphere itself seemed to change. If the opening felt like a storm gathering, this part was a storm breaking wide open, spilling over everything. There was no illusion of safety anymore. Dante's hand was everywhere, his voice echoing through every misstep, every betrayal, every sudden collapse of order. It felt less like a story moving forward, and more like watching a net tighten, a slow constriction that left no space to breathe. The crew, usually so bound together, was fractured across continents. Their separation carried a heaviness. They have always been strongest in unity, and here, that unity was stolen from them. Roman, Tej, Han, and Ramsey, fumbling and improvising their own way, often seemed caught in Dante's game without realizing the rules. Their bickering sometimes brought laughter, but beneath it was a kind of helplessness. And I thought of how true that is in life. How humor often emerges in moments when we have no control, when joking is the only weapon we have against despair. Their antics weren't just comic relief. They were survival, the kind of laughter that hides trembling hands. Letty's arc continued in shadows, her imprisonment a harsh contrast to the chaos unfolding elsewhere. The walls that held her and weren't just physical. They symbolized the attempt to break her spirit. But Letty has always been the unyielding heart of this family, and her determination to fight her way free reminded me of the resilience I've seen in people who endure silence and isolation but refuse to be erased. Her escape wasn't only an action beat. It was a declaration that no prison, no matter how well built, can hold someone who has decided to survive. Dom, meanwhile, carried the weight of everything. His journey through the second half was almost mythological, a man stretched beyond human limits, surviving not because he can but because he must. Every confrontation with Dante felt less like a duel and more like philosophy clashing with philosophy. Dom, rooted in family, in loyalty, in bonds, against Dante, rooted in vengeance, in chaos and theater. Their encounters were not simply physical. They were symbolic. Each car crash, each fight, was a collision of worldviews, of two men embodying entirely different truths. The scenes with Dom's son pulled the narrative into raw emotion. The boy became the embodiment of innocence under siege, a reminder that vengeance doesn't stop at its target but spreads outward, consuming the next generation. Watching Dom's desperation to shield his child, I felt an ache that had nothing to do with cars or explosions. It was a universal fear of parents, of guardians, the terror that the past sins will bleed into the lives of those we love most. That thread carried more weight than any spectacle, because it spoke of something primal, the instinct to protect the future even when the past is relentless. Dante's performance only grew more unsettling. His flamboyance became sharper, his laughter colder. He wasn't simply mocking Dom. He was mocking the very idea of order, of loyalty, of family. There is something terrifying about a villain who doesn't only want to win, but wants to rewrite the meaning of victory itself. Watching him strut through chaos, delighting in carnage, I thought of the trickster archetypes in literature, those figures who destabilize entire worlds not by sheer force, but by mocking the values others hold sacred. Dante is not just antagonist. He is entropy personified, chaos dancing in bright colors. The action itself escalated surreal levels, highways collapsing, vehicles hurtling through the air, destruction staged as theater. At times I laughed at the audacity of it. Cars surviving what no machine ever could, Dom leaping into stunts that broke physics a dozen times over. And yet, I realized that the absurdity is part of the myth. These moments aren't meant to be realistic. They're meant to be allegorical, the modern equivalent of gods hurling lightning, of heroes wrestling monsters. Cars are no longer vehicles. They are chariots of willpower, extensions of philosophy. Watching Dom's charge to survive impossible destruction, I didn't see metal. I saw a determination made flesh. And then came the dam. Towering, ominous, a man-made wall holding back the weight of nature. From the moment it appeared, it felt inevitable that this would be the final stage, the place where reckoning would manifest. Water has always been symbolic, of cleansing, of destruction, of inevitability. The dam became a metaphor for memory itself, for the griefs and sins held back behind walls we convince ourselves will never break. And here, those walls threatened to burst. Dom, standing there with his son, surrounded by enemies, trapped by Dante's orchestration, felt less like a hero and more like a figure of myth, a father standing against a flood, the roar of water behind him, the flames around him, the traps closing in. For years, he has felt untouchable, a man who defied physics and fate alike. But here, he felt cornered, stripped of invincibility. And that was the most humanizing moment of all. Because legends are only compelling when they face something larger than themselves, when their strength feels insufficient, when their silence betrays fear. The cliffhanger came like a punch. There was no resolution, no clean closure, only the weight of inevitability left hanging in the air. Dom and his son, suspended in the moment before the flood. The crew scattered, uncertain. Dante victorious, laughing into the void. And then black. No reassurance, no tidy ending. Only the haunting reminder that not all stories conclude when we want them to. I felt frustration, yes, but also something else. Recognition. Because isn't that how life often feels? Interrupted, unresolved, caught mid-breath. As the second half ended, I didn't leave with adrenaline alone. I left with unease, with a sense of the past had fully caught up, that the flood was inevitable, that family, as strong as it is, may not be enough. And perhaps that was the point. To remind us that even myths are fragile, that even legends tremble before consequence. What always fascinates me about this saga, even more than its roaring engines and collapsing bridges, are the people who carry it. The characters are exaggerated, yes, nearly mythic at this point, but within their exaggerations lie truths that are surprisingly human. To sit with them in this chapter is to sit with old companions, ones whose flaws are glaring but whose loyalty is undeniable, the kind of friends who may frustrate you endlessly, but who you know will stand by you when the world falls apart. Dom is the center, the gravitational pull around which everything else orbits. He has long since transcended the role of the simple man and become something closer to an archetype, the father, the protector, the patriarch whose silence says more than speeches ever could. Watching him here, I was reminded of the fathers I've known who rarely raise their voices, but whose presence filled a room, who seemed carved from something heavier than flesh. Dom's stoicism can feel like armor, but beneath that armor lies fragility. It's in the way his eyes soften when he looks at his son, in the hesitation before he drives into another impossible stunt, in the quiet pauses when the weight of history presses down on him. He is invincible in spectacle, yet deeply human in his fear of loss. That contradiction is what makes him resonate. For me, Dom embodies the truth that strength isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to move forward despite it. Dante is the perfect counterpoint, the storm to Dom's stone. Where Dom is silent, Dante is loud. Where Dom is restrained, Dante is flamboyant. Jason Momoa gives him a theatricality that borders on madness, painting him in bright colors and manic laughter. At first, it seems almost comical, but as his philosophy emerges, that laughter becomes chilling. Because beneath the camp is grief, sharp and raw, a wound dress in glitter. Dante doesn't see himself as villain. He sees himself as avenger, the hand of justice for a father lost. His danger lies not in brute force, but in unpredictability, in the way he rewrites violence as performance. He is not chaos for his own sake. He is chaos convinced of his righteousness. And that, to me, is far more terrifying than any bullet or bomb. In Dante, I see the human impulse to turn pain into spectacle, to mask grief with theater, to demand that the world watches you burn it down. Letty remains the saga's quiet warrior, a woman defined not by speeches but by survival. In this chapter, her imprisonment becomes a canvas for resilience. She is tested, isolated, forced into silence, and yet she refuses to break. Watching her fight her way out reminded me of the countless women I've known whose strength has gone unnoticed, whose endurance is taken for granted, who carry the weight of battles without applause. Letty is not just fierce. She is a reminder that survival itself is a form of defiance. Roman and Tej continue their dance of banter and bickering, and while their comedy often feels exaggerated, I've come to see it as something deeper than just comic relief. Humor, after all, is one of humanity's oldest shields. Their arguments, their jokes, their constant ribbing each other. It isn't trivial. It's survival. They laugh because silence would be unbearable. They joke because fear is too heavy. Watching them, I thought about how often in my own life, in the most chaotic or painful moments, laughter became the only way to breathe. They remind us that humor isn't the absence of seriousness. It's a way of enduring it. Han carries a different weight. He is a ghost who walks among the living, a man resurrected but never truly healed. His calm is tinged with melancholy, his words fewer but sharper, his presence quieter yet heavier. Every look, every gesture feels like it carries the memory of loss. Survival has not freed him. It has scarred him, and that, to me, makes him one of the most human of them all, because survival is never clean. Coming back from death, whether literal or metaphorical, always leaves shadows. Han embodies that truth, that endurance comes with melancholy, and that scars are not erased but worn quietly, almost invisibly on the soul. Newer faces like Brie Larson and Daniela Melchior bring subtle shades to the ensemble. Brie, with her calm authority, steps into the chaos as a stabilizer, someone who brings poise into disorder. Daniela brings warmth and quiet loyalty, a reminder that family expands, that new bonds are always forming. Their roles may be smaller, but they add texture, like new threads woven into an old tapestry. What unites them all are their contradictions. Dom is invincible yet fragile. Dante is flamboyant yet wounded. Letty is fierce yet tender. Roman and Tej are clowns yet survivors. Han is alive yet haunted. Even a newcomer's balance strength with softness. These contradictions are what make them compelling. They are not neat archetypes. They are tangled, messy, human, even within the absurd physics of cars flying and dams collapsing. And in those contradictions, I see reflections of us. We too are strong yet afraid, loud yet broken, fierce yet tender, survivors who laugh to hide pain. These characters, blown up to mythic proportions, mirror the contradictions we carry quietly every day. That's why, for all its success, the saga resonates. Because beneath the explosions and the spectacle, the characters remind us of ourselves, of the way we cling to bonds, the way we endure grief, the way we laugh in chaos, the way we fear losing what we love most. What always enchants me about films of this scale isn't just the noise of what's on screen, but the strange little truths that ripple behind the curtain. The trivia, the odd accidents, the unexpected choices. Those are the things that make the story of the movie almost as fascinating as the movie itself. And in this case, the facts are as wild, messy, and colorful as the film they produced. The first and most jaw-dropping fact is the budget. Over $340 million. Let that settle for a moment. This wasn't just a blockbuster. It became one of the most expensive pieces of cinema ever created. And when you think about what that money represents, thousands of crew members, endless stunt rehearsals, streets in Rome and Lisbon shut down for weeks, fireballs staged with precision, and then digital artists layering effects frame by frame. You realize you're not just watching a film. You're watching the labor of an entire army. I thought about that number as the dam loomed on screen and water threatened to consume everything. The irony struck me. We call it a movie, but in truth it's a monument built with the sweat and fatigue of countless invisible people. Then there's the matter of the director's chair. Justin Lin, who had shaped so much of the saga's identity, abruptly walked away just days into shooting. The whispers were about clashes with Vin Diesel. Tension so sharp, they cracked the foundation. And then, almost overnight, Louis Leterrier was handed the wheel of this speeding juggernaut. Imagine stepping onto a set where hundreds of people are waiting, millions of dollars already spent, a studio demanding spectacle, and knowing you have to deliver without missing a beat. That transition left fingerprints all over the film. You can almost feel the tonal shift, the seams between visions. To me, that is one of the strangest and most fascinating truths, that a story this massive was forged not in harmony but in discord, and that somehow the chaos behind the scenes mirrored the chaos within the narrative. Jason Momoa's performance carries its own trivia. Much of Dante's flamboyant energy, the painted nails, the sing-song menace, the campy mockery, was Momoa's invention. He improvised, he experimented, he leaned into excess when others might have pulled back. On set, some wondered if it was too much, if it would tip into parody. But when the final film played, it became clear. His chaos was the pulse that kept the story alive. That, to me, is a lesson hidden inside the trivia, that sometimes the strangest creative risks become the most memorable truths. And then there's the international sprawl of production. Rome was literally brought to a standstill, its narrow streets shut down so that a bomb could roll through them. Locals woke up to find their neighborhoods turned into chaos. Fire trucks rehearsing explosions, helicopters circling overhead. Imagine sipping an espresso at a cafe and watching Hollywood transform your quiet corner into an apocalyptic playground. In Portugal, entire coastal roads were commandeered. Cliffs turned into cinematic death traps. It blurs the line between fiction and reality. The destruction we see on screen was built on real disruption. Entire cities bent temporarily into playgrounds of myth. Another fact that lingers is the decision to split the story. Originally, this was meant to be a single film, a contained finale. But somewhere in the middle of creation, the choice was made to stretch it, to carve it into two, leaving us hanging on that dam as though suspended in time. It wasn't just a creative choice. It was strategic, financial, a way to extend the saga's life. And while it frustrated audiences, it also felt strangely fitting, because life rarely gives us neat endings. Sometimes we are left hanging, waiting for resolution that may not come when we expect it. Even the cast brought its share of quirks. Brie Larson spoke of how surreal it was to join a family that had been together for decades, like walking into a living room where everyone already knows the inside jokes. Michelle Rodriguez laughed about bruises from the prison fight sequence, admitting that authenticity comes with pain. Tyrese and Ludacris continued their banter even offset, turning interviews into comedy routines that echo their on-screen dynamic. These small facts remind me that the story isn't just what we see, but the bonds and tensions that hum beneath it. And perhaps the strangest fact of all is how, despite its success, despite critics mocking its physics, despite its swollen budget, the film still found its way into the hearts of millions. It became one of the highest-grossing films of its year. It stirred conversations, created memes, reignited debates about what cinema is meant to be. That, to me, is the oddest truth. The story so improbable, stitched together from clashing visions and theatrical performances, still resonates. Maybe because it's less about realism and more about myth. Maybe because it taps into something primal. Our need for family, our fear of vengeance, our love of spectacle. So when I think of the strangest facts, I don't just think of budgets or director swaps or Jason Momoa's painted nails. I think of how the making of the film mirrored the film itself. Chaotic, theatrical, stitched together through improvisation and persistence. It is as though the line between story and production dissolved, leaving us with a film that is both a spectacle and a testament to how messy creation truly is. What stayed with me most as I sat through the chaos of this film were not only the explosions, the roaring engines, or the dam that loomed like a judgment at the end, but the way certain events spoke louder than words. These weren't just action beats designed to thrill. They were metaphors, almost allegories, that hinted at truths far deeper than the spectacle might suggest. When I reflect on these moments, I see them less as stunts and more as symbols, threads that connect to our lives in ways we may not immediately admit, but instinctively feel. The Rome sequence is the clearest example. On the surface, it is pure absurdity. An enormous spherical bomb rolling through ancient streets, fire-consuming piazzas, cars weaving desperately to prevent catastrophe. I laughed when I first saw it. It felt cartoonish in its scale. But then the imagery settled in my mind. Rome, a city of empires, wars, centuries of resilience, suddenly threatened by something it did not create but cannot stop. That bomb is vengeance, rolling without mercy, impossible to steer, impossible to halt. It reminded me of how the past, when it comes back to claim us, doesn't arrive as a whisper. It arrives like a weight, unstoppable, flattening whatever stands in its path. The scene, in all its absurdity, became a meditation for me on how history always finds a way of returning, not gently but violently. The highway set pieces carry a similar weight. Cars flipping through the air, bridges collapsing under impossible strain, metal grinding against stone. At first, it seems designed only for thrill. Yet, when you look closer, bridges in this story are never just structures. They are metaphors for connection, for trust, for bonds between people. Watching one collapse beneath Dom's tires is more than spectacle. It is a reminder of how fragile even the strongest connections can be when strained by vengeance. How often do we assume the bridges in our lives will hold, only to realize they were never as strong as we believed? That collapse on screen is exaggerated, but echoes a truth we all know. Every bond can be tested and not all survive. Dante himself turns each encounter into theater. His performance transforms violence into something staged, almost ritualistic. He doesn't kill quickly. He toys, humiliates, stretches the suffering. And in that theatrical cruelty lies a deeper critique. Violence in our world is rarely about efficiency. More often, it is about message, about performance, about ensuring someone not only suffers, but is seen to suffer. Dante embodies that reality, turning his vengeance into a stage play that Dom and his crew are forced to act in. Watching him mock, laugh, and paint chaos in bright colors unsettled me because it felt too true. How often do we see cruelty dressed in spectacle, pain made into performance, suffering turned into entertainment? Dante is terrifying because he mirrors that distortion of morality, because he forces us to confront how easily grief becomes theater when left unchecked. The dam, though, is the moment where the symbolism crystallizes. It stands as a wall against nature, a human attempt to hold back forces far larger than ourselves. And in the story, it becomes a place of reckoning. Dom and his son face not just enemies but inevitability. The water behind that dam is memory, consequence, history itself, waiting to burst. Watching it, I thought about how often we build our own dams inside us, stacking up regrets, grief, anger, convincing ourselves we've contained them. But water always finds a way, and when it breaks, it does not trickle, it floods. The dam in this film is less a location, and more a symbol of every unresolved truth we try to hold back. And as it trembles, we are reminded, walls always crack, floods always come. Even the cliffhanger ending deserves critical reflection. Critics called it cynical, a manipulation, a way to stretch one story into two. And perhaps it is. But it also struck me as strangely honest. Life rarely gives us neat conclusions. Most of our stories end abruptly, with questions unanswered, with struggles unresolved. To leave Dom and his son suspended, the flood about to crash down, is frustrating, yes, but it mirrors reality. We are always in the middle of something when the lights go out. We are always caught mid-breath. And that honesty, however accidental, is worth noting. What fascinates me most, looking at these events critically, is how they transform when seen through metaphor. The bomb in Rome isn't just a prop. It is vengeance rolling forward. The collapsing bridge isn't only a stunt. It is trust breaking under strain. Dante isn't just flamboyant. He is grief turned into theater. The dam isn't just concrete. It is memory about a burst. Even the cliffhanger isn't just strategy. It is life's incompleteness mirrored on screen. And that, I think, is a strange success of this film. Beneath its noise, it whispers truths we recognize, that the past is unstoppable, that connections are fragile, that grief can become spectacle, that floods cannot be held back, and that life rarely offers closure. These events, dressed in fire and fury, become allegories of the things we live every day but rarely name. And when I left the theater, it wasn't the explosions I carried with me, but those whispers, those reminders that even absurd cinema can reflect truths we carry quietly inside ourselves. What struck me, sitting through the second half of the film and then reflecting on it after, is how much weight each major event carried once I stopped looking at it only as spectacle and started listening to it as symbol. This is, I think, where the movie truly lives, not in its physics-defying stunts, but in the strange truths buried beneath them. Let's return again to Rome. The image of that bomb, massive and relentless, rolling down the heart of one of history's most iconic cities, stayed with me long after. At first, I laughed. It was absurd, even cartoonish, watching cars weave desperately to contain a giant sphere of destruction. But as the laughter faded, I realized how the scene had etched itself into my mind. Because Rome is not just a backdrop. Rome is empire. Rome is history. Rome is survival through centuries of fire, collapse, and rebirth. To threaten it with a man-made bomb was to show us what vengeance does. It mocks history, it defies monuments. It crashes through centuries with no regard for what came before. In that image, I saw not only Dante's cruelty, but also a metaphor for grief unrestrained. Grief does not care for monuments. It does not respect legacy. It crashes forward like that bomb, unstoppable, flattening whatever it meets. The way the scene is staged reminded me of Greek tragedies, where fate itself becomes a villain. Dante is less a man than inevitability. He does not need to chase. He simply sets destruction in motion and lets it roll. And how often does life feel like that? How often do we find ourselves watching helplessly as consequences barrel toward us? The weight of past choices gathering momentum we can't control. In that moment, I realized the absurdity was also honesty. Life's bombs are rarely tidy. They roll through our days, flattening what we thought would stand forever. Then there's the bridge, or more accurately, the bridges, because collapsing structures become a motif throughout this story. The first time a bridge buckled under Dom's tires, I leaned forward, my heart thudding not just in the stunt, but from what it symbolized. Bridges in literature have always been metaphors for connection, for passage, for trust between 2 points. To destroy a bridge is to sever connection, to deny passage, to force isolation. Watching Dom drive across, only for it to crumble beneath him, I thought about the bonds in my own life that I believed were unbreakable, only to watch them collapse under pressure. The stunt became less about a car surviving physics, and more about the fragility of the ties we depend on. And that fragility haunted me more than the explosion. The highway chaos in Portugal carried a similar weight. Cars flew, flipped, collided, and through it all was a reminder that roads themselves are symbols of journeys, of progress, of forward motion. To destroy roads is to interrupt journeys, to fracture destinies. Dante doesn't simply want to kill Dom. He wants to tear apart the paths themselves, to deny any sense of progress, to trap him in chaos with no way forward. In that destruction, I saw echoes of times in life when every road ahead seems blocked, when no matter which direction you turn, the way is closed. The spectacle on screen became, in my mind, a metaphor for despair, the feeling of spinning, of colliding, of being trapped in a loop of destruction with no way out. And then there is Dante himself, turning every event into theater. Watching him mock, taunt, laugh in the face of tragedy, I was unsettled in a way that spectacle alone could never achieve. He reminded me of the trickster figures from myth, Loki in Norse stories, the coyote in Native American traditions, Anansi the spider in African tales. Characters who thrive not on brute strength, but on destabilization, on mocking the values others hold sacred. Dante does the same. He laughs at Dom's loyalty. He parodies the idea of family. He turns vengeance into a camp performance. At first it feels ridiculous, but then you realize the danger. A trickster does not need to win battles. He only needs to undermine belief. And Dante does that with terrifying effectiveness. The Rio flashbacks deserve mention here too. To reframe an old heist, one celebrated, as the origin of grief, is a powerful narrative choice. It forces us to see history differently, to recognize that our victories may be someone else's tragedies. That, to me, is one of the most sobering truths of the film. We often walk away from triumphs convinced of our righteousness, never pause and consider collateral damage. But time reveals what we missed. The Rio sequence is not just a callback. It is a reinterpretation, a reminder that stories are rarely as neat as we first believe. That realization lingered with me, making me reflect on times in my own life when something I celebrated later revealed itself to be someone else's wound. And then we arrive at the dam, the most powerful image of all. From the first moment it appeared, looming in the background, I felt its symbolism. A dam is a human defiance of nature, a wall against inevitability. We build them to contain floods, to control what cannot truly be controlled. And in this story, the dam becomes a stage for final confrontation. Dom and his son stand there, water pressing behind the concrete, enemies closing in, vengeance laughing in their faces. It is less a location than an allegory. The dam is memory. The water is grief, regret, consequence. Dom is every one of us. Standing against a flood we know we cannot hold back forever. The cliffhanger ending, placing father and son against that wall of water, struck me as both manipulative and honest. Manipulative because it denies closure, stretching resolution into another film. Honest because life itself so rarely gives us neat endings. We are always caught mid-story, always suspended in unresolved tension, waiting for floods that may or may not come. I left the theater frustrated, yes, but also strangely moved, because that unfinished ending mirrored reality more closely than any polished resolution could have. Even smaller events, when looked at critically, reveal depth. Letty's prison escape is more than an action beat. It is resilience against confinement, a metaphor for how strength often reveals itself in silence, away from recognition. Roman and Tedge's comic misadventures are not just jokes. They are reminders of how laughter shields us from despair. Han's quiet glances remind us that survival does not erase scars. Each event, each subplot, becomes a parable when seen through the right lens. Critics have often dismissed the saga as hollow, as excess without substance. And yes, it is excessive. Yes, it defies physics, logic, and sometimes taste. But what I carry with me after reflecting on these events is not hollowness. It is resonance. The bomb as vengeance. The bridges as fragile bonds. Dante as a trickster. The dam as consequence. The cliffhanger as life's incompleteness. These are not empty images. They are exaggerated, yes, but they echo truths we live every day. And that, to me, is what makes this story endure despite everything. Beneath the absurdity, beneath the explosions, it whispers about inevitability, about grief, about family, about the floods we all know are coming. The events are not just events. They are symbols, mirrors, reminders. And that is why, when I think of this film, I do not remember only the roar of engines or the fire of explosions. I remember the bomb rolling through Rome, the bridge collapsing, the dam trembling. I remember them not as stunts, but as metaphors of things that haunt us all. What always fascinates me about a film on this scale is that the drama doesn't end at the camera lens. So much of what we see, the explosions, the roaring engines, the destruction of whole cities, is only the surface. Beneath it lies another story, quieter but just as chaotic, the story of how the film was made. And with this saga, that behind-the-scenes tale is every bit as dramatic, messy, and strangely poetic as what we watch on screen. The most striking piece of production lore is the director's chair itself. Justin Lin, the man who had become almost synonymous with the identity of the franchise, walked away only days into shooting. For years, he had been the architect of the saga's rhythm, its balance of absurdity and sincerity, its ability to pull cars into the sky while still somehow insisting that family was the anchor. And yet, in those early days of production, cracks appeared. Rumors swirled of creative clashes with Vin Diesel, of frustrations over control, of exhaustion after years of steering the juggernaut. Whatever the cause, Lin's departure sent shockwaves through the crew. Imagine hundreds of people, millions of dollars already spent, sets prepared, stunts rehearsed, and then the architect walks away. For a moment, it must have felt like the entire house would collapse. Into that void stepped Louis Leterrier. Practically overnight, he was handed the reins of a story already in motion, a production already burning money with every passing hour. I picture him walking on to set those first days, cameras ready, cast waiting, crew anxious, and feeling the weight of inheriting not just a film but an empire. To direct is always to wrestle with chaos, but to direct under those conditions is to leap into a storm mid-flight. And yet, he did. He adapted, reshaped, stitched together visions that weren't entirely his, and somehow carried the project forward. That, to me, is one of the most compelling truths of this production, that it was born in conflict, that it was forged through fracture. And in that way, the making of the film mirrors its story, a family strained, tested, but determined to keep moving forward. Then there is the budget. Over $340 million, making it one of the most expensive movies ever made. The number itself is staggering, almost surreal. But when you think about what that money represents, it begins to make sense. Entire city streets shut down for weeks. Dozens of stunt drivers rehearsing impossible flips again and again until the choreography felt like muscle memory. Pyrotechnics staged with surgical precision, only to be erased in moments of fire. Visual effects teams across the globe layering frames with destruction, floodwaters, and collapsing concrete. Costume designers stitching outfits that would appear for seconds. Thousands of hands, thousands of hours, all woven into a spectacle that devours money like fire devours oxygen. And that's what this budget really is. Not excess for its own sake, but a monument to how many people it takes to build a myth. Jason Momoa's performance carries its own production lore. Much of Dante's flamboyant personality, the painted nails, the sing-song menace, the playful mockery, was his invention. The script gave him the bones, but he added the flesh. On set, he experimented, improvising, testing the boundaries of how far he could push the character. At times, people worried he was going too far, that his camp energy would tip the villain into parody. But Momoa trusted his instincts, and the crew began to see what he was doing, turning Dante into theater, transforming vengeance into performance. It was risky, but that risk became the pulse of the film. And in that fact lies a lesson I love, that sometimes the strangest choices, the ones that feel almost reckless, become the very heart of the story. The locations themselves tell stories. Rome was not merely a green screen illusion. Whole streets were commandeered, monuments guarded, traffic rerouted. Residents woke to find their neighborhoods transformed into battlegrounds of spectacle. Picture sipping coffee at a small Roman cafe, only to see crews rehearsing the role of a giant bomb past your doorstep. For weeks, the Eternal City became a playground of Hollywood chaos, its ancient stones echoing not with prayers, but with engines and fire rigs. Portugal, too, was transformed. Its sun-soaked cliffs turned into arenas of impossible chases. These places were not just backdrops. They were collaborators in the creation of myth. And I imagine the locals watching half in awe, half in annoyance, as their homes became stages for legends. Another fascinating fact is the decision to split the film. Originally, this was meant to be one story, a contained finale. But somewhere in the middle of production, the choice was made to stretch it, to carve it into two. Some call it greed, some call it strategy. But whatever the reason, it changed everything. Suddenly, what was meant to resolve became suspended. The dam didn't break, it threatened. The flood didn't crash, it loomed. And we were left hanging in frustration. Yet that choice reflects something about cinema today. Endings are luxuries. In a world hungry for franchises, resolution is delayed, suspended, parceled out for maximum anticipation. It is strange, frustrating, and oddly fitting. Because isn't life itself often like that? Rarely do we get neat closure. More often we are left mid-breath, mid-sentence, waiting. Behind the scenes, the cast carry their own truths. Michelle Rodriguez has spoken of the bruises and exhaustion from filming the prison sequences, of the toll it took to deliver authenticity. Tyrese and Ludacris joke through interviews, their off-screen banter echoing the comic relief they provide on-screen. Brie Larson described the surreal feeling of joining a family that had already been together for decades, walking into a room where the bonds were already formed, the inside jokes already carved into history. And Vin Diesel, ever the patriarch, carried the weight of responsibility, speaking in interviews with solemn reverence about family as though it were gospel. These glimpses remind me that behind every line, every stunt, are people, tired, bruised, laughing, improvising, carrying the myth on their shoulders. And perhaps the strangest fun fact of all is how, despite everything, the chaos of a director leaving, the swollen budget, the critics who rolled their eyes, the film still succeeded. It earned hundreds of millions worldwide, still filled theaters, still stirred memes and debates. It became a paradox, mocked by many, loved by many, impossible to ignore. That, to me, is the oddest truth, that something so improbable, stitched together in conflict and chaos, still resonates. Maybe because it isn't about coherence. Maybe because it's about myth, about watching a family endure against floods, about seeing vengeance dressed in glitter, about feeling that, no matter how absurd, the story reflects something true about us. So when I think of production, I don't just see cameras and cranes. I see the chaos of a director walking away. I see Louis Leterrier stepping in with steady hands. I see Jason Momoa laughing as he improvised Dante into existence. I see Rome brought to a standstill, Portugal turned into theater, Michelle Rodriguez bruised but proud, Vin Diesel solemn about family. I see chaos stitched into spectacle, fracture stitched into myth. And in that, I realize the production itself was a story, messy, loud, fractured, but determined to endure, just like the family it portrays. What I carry with me most after the roar of the engines fades and the fire of the explosions cools isn't only the characters or even the plot, but the spaces they inhabit. In a story like this, the setting isn't background. It is a character of its own. Cities, roads, cliffs, and dams breathe life into the film, shaping its rhythm, coloring its atmosphere, whispering meanings that words alone could never convey. Watching this chapter unfold, I realized how much the settings themselves told the story, how the camera's gaze transformed landscapes into symbols, and how the very air of these places seeped into the myth. Rome was the first to leave its mark. The city of emperors, of ruins, of centuries stacked upon centuries, suddenly rattled by a bomb rolling like a grotesque parody of fate. The chase through its narrow streets felt both absurd and sacrilegious. Fire licked across piazzas that had seen revolutions. Monuments shook as though history itself were trembling. The image unsettled me not only because of its chaos, but because of what it symbolized. Rome has always been a city of survival, a place that endured collapse after collapse and rose again. To threaten it with annihilation was to show us that vengeance mocks endurance, that even the strongest monuments can be undone in seconds. I thought of the cities of my own life, the places I've walked through casually, and how easily they too could be reshaped, erased, consumed. In that sense, the setting wasn't just chosen for spectacle. Rome was chosen because it carried history, and history here was being devoured by vengeance. Portugal came next, sunlit cliffs and coastal roads, winding like veins along the edge of the earth. Watching cars tear across those precarious strips of asphalt with the endless ocean yawning beside them was breathtaking. The setting wasn't just beautiful, it was precarious. Those cliffs whispered fragility. One wrong turn, one misstep, and everything would collapse into the abyss. The chase scenes are felt mythic, almost like gods battling along the edge of the world, the ocean watching with indifference. For me, that setting became a metaphor for the razor's edge we all walk in life, the illusion of stability when, in truth, we are always inches away from collapse. The beauty of those cliffs made the danger sharper, the thrill more haunting, because it reminded us that even paradise carries the possibility of ruin. And then came the dam, the most powerful of all. Its towering concrete walls held back the weight of nature, a flood pressed into silence. From the moment it appeared on screen, it became less a location and more a symbol. Dams are monuments to human defiance, our attempt to control what cannot truly be controlled. And here, that defiance became fragile. Dom, standing with his son against the backdrop of that massive wall, felt like a man facing consequence itself. The water behind him wasn't just water. It was memory, regret, grief, all the sins of the past pressed against concrete, waiting to burst. The dam carried inevitability in its very presence. And when Dante turned into a trap, I felt the metaphor sharpen. You can build walls against your past, but walls always crack, and when they break, floods do not trickle, they devour. Even smaller settings, when I think back, carried weight. The sterile prison where Letty fought for survival. Its cold, metallic walls were suffocation embodied. It wasn't just a place to hold her body. It was a metaphor for attempts to confine her spirit. Watching her claw her way out made me think of how resilience always begins in silence, in isolation, where no one is watching. The neon-lit streets, buzzing with menace, carried a different energy. Temptation, danger, the seduction of chaos. Even the quiet kitchen tables, where family gathered in fleeting moment of peace, felt like sanctuaries, brief oases in a desert of destruction. These small spaces mattered because they balanced the chaos, reminding us that even in storms, there are still places of warmth, still corners of safety. Cinematography turned these settings into poetry. Wide shots of Rome burning gave us scale, the reminder that vengeance doesn't only wound individuals but devours civilizations. Drone shots of cars racing cliffsides turned them into myths. Chariots of gods dueling at the edge of the world. Low angles of the dam exaggerated its immensity, transforming it into a deity looming over father and son. And then, in contrast, close-ups of faces, Dom's eyes flickering with fear, Letty's jaw tightening in defiance, Dante's grin twisting into menace, reminded us that within these vast settings, it is still human beings who carry the weight. The contrast between scale and intimacy is what gave the settings their emotional power. Colors spoke their own language. Dom was always framed in muted tones, blacks, grays, earthy shades, grounding him in restraint, in stoic seriousness. Dante, by contrast, exploded in flamboyant purples, reds, and blues, colors that mocked the severity of the world around him. Rome burned in orange fire. Portugal gleamed in golden light. The Dam stood in cold steel grays. Every palette was a mood, every shade a whisper of meaning. Watching these choices, I was reminded that cinema is a language of color as much as dialogue. We don't just see, we feel through hues, through contrasts, through the way light bends across stone and steel. Sound further deepened the atmosphere. Rome echoed with ancient stone cracking under modern fire, the bomb rolling like thunder across cobblestones. Portugal hummed with engines swallowed by the ocean's endless roar, reminding us that nature always drowns human noise. The Dam carried silence heavier than explosions, the silence of anticipation, of water pressed against walls, of inevitability waiting. These soundscapes shaped how we felt the settings, not just how we saw them. When I look back, I realize the film could not have lived without its settings. Rome taught us that history is fragile. Portugal reminded us that beauty is always perched on the edge of collapse. The Dam warned us that floods of consequence cannot be held back forever. Even the smallest rooms, the prisons, the tables, the neon streets, spoke truths about confinement, sanctuary, temptation. These places were not decoration. They were storytellers, silent narrators who carried meaning more profound than dialogue ever could. And in that realization, I saw something universal. Our own lives are shaped by settings just as much as stories are. The cities we live in, the rooms we sit in, the roads we travel, they shape who we are, how we act, what we fear, what we love. Settings are not passive. They are active participants in our stories. And in this film, that truth was amplified to mythic scale. Rome, Portugal, the Dam. These weren't backdrops. They were voices, echoing truths about history, fragility, and inevitability. What always intrigues me most about films of this size isn't just what they put in front of us, but what happened behind the curtain. We see the finished spectacle, the cars flying, the bridges collapsing, the dam trembling. But behind every explosion is a tired crew. Behind every performance is an actor struggling, improvising, or pushing against limits. The film may look like polished chaos, but its making was chaos of a different kind. And in some ways, that story is even more compelling. The biggest crack in production came almost at the start. Justin Lin, the director who had guided the saga through many of its defining chapters, walked away just days into filming. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't clean. Reports spoke of clashes with Vin Diesel, of disagreements so sharp they became irreconcilable. For a project this size, with cameras already rolling and sets already built, such a departure is a small earthquake. Hundreds of people depend on the director's vision. When that vision vanishes, the whole machine falters. I imagine the silence on set that day, the uneasy looks, the whispered questions. Can this survive? Will this collapse? And then Louis Leterrier stepped in. Practically overnight, he inherited not just a film but a crisis. He had to learn the rhythms of a crew that had already been bruised, take over a project that was already in motion, and still deliver the kind of spectacle audiences expect. To me, that is as mythic as anything on screen. He was like a driver asked to take the wheel of a car already speeding downhill. And somehow he did. The seams may show, the tonal shifts, the moments where the narrative feels like it's been stitched together. But that's not weakness. That's the scar tissue of survival. Then there's a cast, carrying their own behind-the-scenes truths. Vin Diesel, the patriarch not only of the story but of production, has always spoken about family not just as a theme, but as a way of working. He carries that weight, sometimes too heavily. Some crew members have described him as solemn, almost priest-like, treating the franchise as sacred. That reverence can inspire, but it can also clash. It's not hard to imagine the tension of balancing Diesel's vision with the needs of others, especially a director trying to assert control. Yet his seriousness, his gravity, is also what holds the ensemble together. He is Dom on screen, but in a way, he is Dom off screen too, the center around which everything else revolves. Jason Momoa, by contrast, brought chaos and joy. On set, he was said to be unpredictable, constantly laughing, constantly experimenting with Dante's persona. The painted nails, the flamboyant gestures, the camp menace, much of that wasn't written. It was invented in the moment. Some crew worried he was going too far, that audiences wouldn't take the villain seriously. But Momoa insisted on risk, on pushing boundaries. His energy was infectious. In interviews, his castmates admitted that his laughter often carried them through long, exhausting days. And isn't that just like Dante himself? To destabilize, to unsettle, to make people laugh and shudder at the same time. Even off-screen, Momoa embodied the trickster energy he gave the film. Michelle Rodriguez carried another truth, the toll of physicality. Her prison escape sequence left her bruised, sore, exhausted. She has spoken before about how authenticity demands pain, how action sequences are never as glamorous as they look. Behind every fight scene is repetition, sweat, and injury. Watching her on screen, I thought of that, how much unseen effort and endurance is baked into a few minutes of spectacle. Her resilience isn't just Letty's resilience. It's her own. Tyrese Gibson and Ludacris brought their banter off-screen as well. They joked during interviews, teased each other relentlessly, and kept morale alive with humor. That constant joking may seem trivial, but on a set filled with pressure, tension, and exhaustion, laughter is survival. Their humor wasn't just comic relief on screen. It was relief for the crew as well. They reminded everyone that even in chaos, joy matters. Brie Larson, stepping into this long-established family, described how surreal it felt. She compared it to walking into a living room where everyone already knows the inside jokes, where bonds are already carved deep. Joining a cast that has been together for decades is intimidating. But she also spoke of warmth, of how quickly she was welcomed. That's the paradox of family. It is intimidating, but it also expands. Watching her, I thought of what it feels like to join new circles in our own lives, how we slip into histories that existed before us, and how those histories either shut us out or fold us in. And then there are the quieter behind-the-scenes stories. Crews working 16-hour days in Portugal to capture golden light before the sun dropped. Stunt drivers rehearsing for weeks only to crash in seconds of screen time. Visual effects artists laboring for months on sequences audiences would dismiss as over the top. These are the invisible hands, the unglamorous truths of cinema. For every roar of applause in theaters, there are hundreds of exhausted hands clapping silently behind the curtain. What fascinates me most is how the behind-the-scenes drama mirrors the story itself. A director leaves, the family fractures. Another steps in, the family stitches itself together. Tensions flare, laughter relieves, bruises are carried, risks are taken. It is, in its own way, the same story of resilience, chaos, and loyalty. The making of the film is its own myth, one we don't see on screen, but one we feel in the seams. And perhaps that is the greatest insight. Cinema is never neat. It is messy, conflicted, exhausting. But within that mess, within that exhaustion, a story emerges, not just the one written in the script, but the one lived by those who built it. Fast X is not only about family surviving vengeance. It is about a crew surviving chaos, an ensemble enduring fracture, a director inheriting disaster, and still, somehow, a story being told. What lingers after fireballs dim and the chase scenes fade is not just the adrenaline, but the quiet echo of meaning. Every film in this saga has claimed family as its heart. But here, that word feels heavier, more fragile, like a mantra recited not in triumph but in desperation. I realized as I sat through the storm of this chapter that what it truly offered wasn't new stunts or bigger explosions, but meditation, however disguised, on family, vengeance, legacy, chaos, and inevitability. Family has always been the cornerstone. In earlier films, it was almost a slogan, a word repeated, so often became a meme. But here, it trembles with vulnerability. Dom speaks less of family than before, yet every action radiates it. Every risk he takes, every impossible stunt, every moment of silence with his son. He is not protecting an idea. He is protecting flesh and blood, the tangible people who give him reason to breathe. Watching him shield his boy reminded me of dinners with friends I come call family, of moments where laughter carried us through chaos. Family is not invincible, the film seems to say. It is always under threat, always fragile. but its fragility does not diminish its power. It makes it sacred. Dante embodies the opposite pole, vengeance, but not vengeance in a clean, efficient sense. His vengeance is operatic, theatrical. He doesn't want Dom dead. He wants him broken, humiliated, dragged through suffering. He is flamboyant because vengeance itself often disguises pain with excess. He is theatrical because grief, left to rot, becomes performance. Watching him mock Dom's loyalty, I thought about how often in our own lives pain turns into spectacle. We laugh too loudly. We act too wildly. We mask grief by making sure the world sees our performance. Dante is terrifying not only because of what he does, but because of what he represents. Grief without healing, grief turned into theater. Legacy threads itself through the story as well. By reaching back to Rio, the film reframes triumph as seed of tragedy. What once felt like victory becomes the origin of vengeance. That is the truth about legacy. It is never one-sided. Every win carries loss for someone else. Every triumph casts a shadow. Dom and his family live in the glow of their past victories. But Dante emerges from the shadow of those same victories, a reminder that history always has another version. Watching this, I thought about the choices I've celebrated, the moments I considered success, and how often I failed to consider whose story was rewritten in that moment, whose wound was carved by my joy. Legacy is double-edged, and the film refuses to let us forget it. Chaos is another theme, embodied not just by Dante, but by the very structure of film. Set pieces don't unfold with neat precision. They unravel with messy unpredictability. Bridges collapse mid-chase. Bombs roll off course. Plans fracture. Allies scatter. Chaos here is an accident. It is philosophy. Dante thrives on it, turning order into disorder, loyalty into doubt, spectacle into mockery. And isn't that how chaos works in life? Not neat, not planned, but creeping in through cracks, destabilizing what we thought was steady. Chaos doesn't always need force. Sometimes it only needs laughter, flamboyance, and the patience to wait for bonds to weaken. Inevitability weaves through it all. From the first flashback to Rio, the story whispers that the past cannot be outrun. The bomb in Rome rolls like consequence itself, unstoppable. The collapsing bridges show us that connections cannot hold forever. The dam, looming, reminds us that floods always come. Even the cliffhanger, frustrating as it is, speaks of incompleteness. The reminder that closure is rare, that life itself often leaves us mid-breath, unfinished. Inevitability is perhaps the heaviest theme of all, the one that presses on Dom's silence, the one that hums behind Dante's laughter. It is the truth that no matter how fast you drive, the past will catch you. Symbolism runs deep through the imagery. Cars, once simple machines, have become chariots of willpower. Dom's charger is more than metal. It is his soul, his determination, his refusal to surrender. Dante's flamboyant rides mirror his chaos, his need to perform destruction as theater. Bridges symbolize fragile bonds, collapsing under strain. The dam symbolizes memory and regret. Walls built to hold back floods that always find a way through. Fire consumes victories, reminding us that nothing man-made endures forever. Even colors speak their own language. Dom in muted blacks and grays, grounded in restraint. Dante in purples and reds, mocking seriousness with flamboyance. Rome burning in orange flames. Portugal glowing in golden light. The dam looming in cold steel grays. Every shade is mood, every palette a whisper of theme. Even sound carries symbolism. The roar of engines is not just adrenaline. It is a heartbeat of survival. The silence before explosion speaks of anticipation. The pause before consequence. Dante's laughter isn't only madness. It is grief disguised, vengeance mocking loyalty. When I heard that laugh echo across destruction, I thought of how often in life laughter hides pain, how often the loudest voices conceal the deepest wounds. What makes these themes resonate isn't that they are hidden. They are not subtle. They are painted in fire, shouted in engines, screamed in color. But sometimes subtlety isn't necessary. Sometimes truth needs to be loud, flamboyant, impossible to ignore. Family is fragile. Vengeance is theater. Legacy is double-edged. Chaos is philosophy. Inevitability is inescapable. These are not quiet truths. They are truths we live daily, sometimes whispering them, sometimes denying them, sometimes watching them crash through our lives like bombs through Rome. And that, I think, is a strange poetry of the saga. It may look absurd, but it speaks in symbols we all understand. That is why we return, not for realism, but for resonance. We watch Dom shield his son, because we know what it feels like to fear for the ones we love. We watch Dante laugh through vengeance, because we know what it feels like to mask pain. We watch bridges collapse, because we've seen bonds fracture. We watch dams tremble, because we felt floods of grief pressing against walls inside us. When I think about this chapter, what fascinates me most isn't only what it says, but how it says it. Cinema, after all, is a language of techniques. Every choice of lens, of cut, of sound, of silence becomes a sentence. And in a saga that has become less about realism and more about myth, those choices aren't just craft, they are philosophy. To watch this film is to listen to its techniques, shouting, whispering, and sometimes stumbling, but always shaping the way we feel. The camera is restless. It glides, swoops, spins, and hurls itself into the storm with reckless energy. Wide shots stretch across cities, turning Rome into a board game of chaos, Portugal into a mythic battleground, the dam into a looming deity. Then, without warning, the lens dives into intimacy, a close-up of Dom's eyes flickering with fear, Dante's grin twisting into menace, Letty's jaw tightening in defiance. This rhythm of scale, grand to intimate, intimate to grand, becomes its own language. It tells us that the myth is vast, but the stakes are personal, that the story is both empire and kitchen table, both dam and glance. Editing carries the same heartbeat. The cuts are relentless, rapid, chaotic, mimicking the sensation of being overwhelmed. At times, they border on incoherence. Cars spinning, explosions colliding, geography dissolving. But maybe that's the point. Chaos isn't supposed to be tidy. In moments of despair, life rarely feels coherent. And then, in contrast, the editing slows. A lingering shot of Dom with his son. A pause on Letty's silence. A still frame of Dante savoring destruction. Those pauses matter because they remind us that beneath the spectacle lies fragility. That rhythm, chaos, then pause, then chaos again, becomes an emotional texture of the film. Sound design is perhaps its strongest weapon. Engines roar not like machines, but like beasts, guttural and primal. Explosions thunder with the weight of God striking. But beyond the noise, it's the quieter sounds that impress me most. Tires screeching across ancient cobblestones in Rome. The subtle drip of water echoing in the dam's belly. The faint groan of steel before collapse. These sounds are whispers of inevitability, reminders that destruction isn't sudden. It announces itself in small tremors first. And then there's the silence. Before the flood, before the explosion, the silence stretches, heavy and suffocating. That silence speaks louder than any detonation. Music weaves old and new. Brian Tyler score resurrect motifs from earlier films, but reshapes them with darker tones. Themes once triumphant now sound mournful, almost funereal. The layering of Latin rhythms, hip-hop beats, and orchestral swells turns the soundtrack into a tapestry of identity, a reminder that this saga was born on streets but now speaks in myth. What moved me most were moments where music mocked itself. Dante's entrances often pair with ironic or campy tracks, twisting menace into theater. It told me that even the score had been weaponized as part of his philosophy. Cinematography painted symbols in every frame. Dom, always bathed in muted tones, framed against stone, asphalt, shadows. A man of restraint, grounded, stoic. Dante, lit in flamboyant colors, purples and reds screaming excess, framed in wide angles that exaggerated his mockery. Rome burned orange, Portugal glowed gold. The dam stood cold and gray. These palettes weren't decoration. They were narrative. They whisper morality through color, philosophy through light. Watching them, I realized the film was less about dialogue than about hues. Black versus purple, restraint versus flamboyance, stone versus glitter. Even the stunts, impossible as they were, served as technique. Cars are no longer cars. They are metaphors, visual sentences in the grammar of myth. A car driving down the side of a dam isn't meant to be believable. It is meant to be allegorical. It tells us that determination drives against inevitability, that fathers defy floods for sons, that myths ignore physics because they answer to symbolism, not science. And while critics scoff at the implausibility, I see it as consistent with myth-making. Hercules fought hydras. Dom fights dams. Different eras. Same grammar of exaggeration. Then there's a machinery beyond the camera, the box office. With a budget swollen beyond $340 million, the film became one of the most expensive ever made. That number itself is technique. In a way, the industry's way of signaling scale, ambition, excess. And the return? Around $700 million worldwide. By some measures, underwhelming. By others, astonishing. That paradox reflects a strange state of cinema today. A film mocked for absurdity, weighed down by cost, still pulled millions into theaters, still became an event. That, to me, is the true power of myth. People return not because they believe in realism, but because they crave resonance. They crave family, spectacle, catharsis. The box office tells us less about profit and more about hunger. Hunger for stories that feel larger than life, even when they defy logic. Critics, of course, dissected the techniques with disdain. They called the editing incoherent, the physics laughable, the spectacle hollow. But audiences spoke differently. They laughed, yes, but they also returned. They memed Dante into cultural memory. They argued about the dam. They celebrated the absurdity. And in that contrast lies another truth. Techniques are never neutral. What critics dismiss, audiences embrace. Because cinema is not only about coherence. It is about impact. And impact often requires noise, flamboyance, exaggeration. When I reflect on the filmmaking of this saga, I don't see subtle craft. I see bold strokes, loud choices, contradictions. A camera that refuses to rest. Editing that overwhelms. Sound that shakes. Silence that suffocates. Music that mocks and mourns. Colors that whisper morality. Stunts that reject physics but embrace allegory. A budget that shocks. A box office that proves hunger endures. It may not be elegant, but it is undeniable. And perhaps that is the technique's greatest achievement. Not to be admired for precision, but to be remembered for force. Because cinema, at its core, is about memory. And I will not forget the roar of that engine, the silence of that dam, the purple of Dante's laughter. These techniques, messy as they are, etch themselves into memory. And that is the language of myth. The story of a film is not complete when the credits roll. In many ways, it continues in the voices of the people who created it and in the murmurs, shouts, and whispers of those who watch it. With Fast X, that afterlife becomes as textured and layered as the film itself. The cast who embody these larger-than-life characters sit before cameras in interviews or lean against each other during casual press junkets. And the way they talk tells us almost as much about the film as the story on screen. Then there are the audiences spilling onto forums, into YouTube reviews, or simply talking among friends in dimly lit cafes, who build their own mythology around what they have seen. Together, these strands, cast reflections, interview snippets, audience reviews, create a secondary narrative, a chorus that surrounds a movie and reshapes how it is remembered. Vin Diesel is always at the heart of these conversations. He has, over the years, become not only the star of the saga, but its custodian, its storyteller-in-chief. In the press cycles for this film, he carried himself like a man who understands both the weight of legacy and the vulnerability of performance. His interviews often return to one central word, family, and while some outsiders dismissed it as a marketing cliché, Diesel's tone suggested something deeper, something personal. He spoke of Paul Walker with an almost trembling reverence, recalling the ways in which Walker's presence still lives in the atmosphere of every set, every table read, every long day on location. He framed Fast X as a kind of conversation with absence, a film that needed to honor the ghostly presence of someone who had defined the heart of the saga. Michelle Rodriguez, fiery as ever, did not soften her word in interviews. She laughed at the absurdity of certain stunts, admitting she sometimes asked herself how long the laws of physics could continue bend before they snapped. But she also insisted that Letty Ortiz is one of those characters who is bigger than believability, someone who thrives in the space between raw realism and superheroic exaggeration. Her comments revealed the tension at the heart of the film, the need to ground something in human emotion while simultaneously inflating it into pure spectacle. She spoke with candor about the exhaustion of shooting in Rome, the body aches after repeated takes of fight scenes, and the satisfaction of knowing that these aches were scars of contribution to a story beloved by millions. Jason Momoa's interviews became events unto themselves. Here was a man who clearly relished playing against type, who wanted to craft a villain who was not simply brooding but flamboyant, even joyous in his violence. He told reporters that he wanted Dante to feel like a rock and roll version of chaos, someone who danced through destruction instead of grimly orchestrating it. He laughed about how he improvised, how he painted his nails between takes and slipped into the character, how he asked to ride motorcycles in ridiculous costumes just to push the image further. Watching him talk, one sense a performer liberated, someone who had been given permission to color outside the lines and who had seized that permission with both hands. His energy spilled into the press junkets. He teased Diesel. He cracked jokes at the expense of stunts. He carried himself like the embodiment of playful menace. Tyrese Gibson and Ludacris, meanwhile, extended their on-screen chemistry into real life. In interviews, they were inseparable, constantly ribbing each other, laughing at inside jokes, and reminding the audience that the humor in their characters was not manufactured, but drawn directly from the fabric of their friendship. They recounted moments when entire scenes were altered on the spot because their banter felt sharp in the script, and how directors encouraged them to lean into that chemistry. Their words showed how the series has always survived not only on its high-stakes plots, but on the sense of genuine camaraderie that holds the ensemble together. Brie Larson, fresh to the saga, spoke with the wonder of someone stepping into a mythology she had long admired. She described how intimidating it felt to join a cast that already moved like a family, how she watched Diesel command the set with a mix of authority and tenderness, and how she wanted to prove herself worthy of the trust fans had already placed in this long-running franchise. She compared the experience to walking into a living legend, as though she were both actor and pilgrim. There was sincerity in her tone, a desire to contribute something authentic even in the midst of exaggerated spectacle. What struck me as I listened to these interviews was not only what the actors said, but the rhythm with which they said it. The laughter, the pauses, the way Diesel would grow suddenly solemn when Walker's name came up, or the way Momoa could not keep from grinning as he described villainy. These cadences painted portraits of human beings who were still, after so many years, deeply invested in the world they were building. They did not sound like actors mechanically promoting a film. They sounded like participants in a shared ritual, aware of the audience's expectations, aware of their own histories, aware of the fragility of legacy. But beyond the cast, the voices of audiences rise, and they are just as critical in shaping the narrative of Fast X. Walk into a cinema on opening night and you hear it. The laughter at the absurdity of cars swinging from helicopters, the gasps at sudden betrayals, the cheers when familiar character makes a triumphant return. Online, these responses crystallize into reviews, comments, and threads. Some audiences praise the sheer audacity of the stunts, applauding the franchise's refusal to retreat from excess. Others criticize the bloated runtime, the melodrama stretched to the point of parody. And yet, even in criticism, there was a recognition that this series is not judged by the same yardstick as other films. It is judged by how effectively it continues to embody the spirit of its saga. Fan reviews often dance between mockery and reverence. A YouTube comment might begin with, "This is the dumbest movie I've ever loved," a paradox that perfectly encapsulates the strange magnetism of the franchise. People laughed at how gravity seemed optional, at how Dom could endure wrecks that would kill ordinary mortals, at how family seemed to solve problems more reliably than strategy. And yet, those same people admitted to tears when echoes of Paul Walker's presence surfaced, when Dom's determination to protect his son resonated in quiet ways. It was as though the franchise had created its own language, one where excess and sincerity coexist, where satire and sincerity overlap without ever canceling each other out. Critics, predictably, were harsher. Reviews in major outlets often pointed to narrative incoherence, to spectacle overwhelming substance, to villainy played with too much camp. But even critics could not entirely resist the gravitational pull of the saga's charm. Many noted that Momoa's Dante, however divisive, injected fresh energy into the formula. Others admitted that for all its flaws, the film succeeded in delivering exactly what longtime fans wanted: speed, loyalty, and unapologetic extravagance. Among audiences, the conversation stretched beyond the film itself. On Reddit threads, people debated the physics of certain stunts with surprising seriousness, crafting diagrams of how a car might actually swing off a dam. On Twitter, memes circulated within hours, celebrating Dante's flamboyance or poking fun at Diesel's stone-faced delivery of emotional lines. In Facebook groups dedicated to Paul Walker's memory, fans discuss how Fast X managed to honor his legacy without cheap exploitation. These dialogues became part of the film's cultural fabric, proving that the true life of a movie lies not only in what happens on screen, but in how it continues to reverberate after. There is something moving in realizing that a film so often dismissed as simple action fodder has generated such intricate conversations, both among its creators and its audiences. It reveals the paradox of Fast X, a film both ridiculous and revered, both mocked and cherished, both excessive and deeply human. The cast words and interviews remind us of the devotion behind the spectacle. The audience reviews, whether glowing or scathing, remind us of the devotion that receives it. Together, they form a dialogue, a conversation between those who craft stories and those who consume them, each shaping the other. In that conversation, Fast X is not just a 2-hour spectacle of fire and metal. It is a cultural event, a meeting point where performance, memory, and community collide. And in that collision, in that noisy, messy, exhilarating collision, the saga proves why it endures. Because it is not only about cars and explosions, but about people who continue, against all odds, to gather around a fire story. There comes a point in any story, no matter how fast the engines roar or how high the stakes climb, when silence settles and reflection takes its rightful place. Fast X is one of those films that reminds us that cinema is not simply projection of images, but the weaving of experiences, emotions, and echoes that linger long after the house lights rise. It is in this space, in the afterglow, that one truly begins to understand what the film has given, what it has taken, and what it dares us to remember. Looking back, the journey through this chapter feels less like watching a movie and more like attending a ritual. From the thunder of tires against European streets to the intimate moments of family meals, the film pulses with the rhythm of continuation. The narrative stretches across impossible arcs, and yet, within that excess, there lies something profoundly human. Every character seems caught between myth and mortality, between spectacle and sincerity, and it is in this tension that the saga has always found its identity. The cast themselves, in their interviews, echoed this duality. Vin Diesel spoke not as an actor performing for applause, but as a guardian carrying forward a legacy that belonged as much to Paul Walker as it does to him. Michelle Rodriguez reminded us of the physicality and rawness required to keep her character grounded in a world that constantly flirts with the supernatural. Jason Momoa showed us how villainy could be playful, even theatrical, without losing menace. And Brie Larson reminded us of what it feels like to step into a myth too large for one person, to find a place in a family that has long preceded you. These voices did not just promote a film. They expanded it, offering windows into how the story breathes off-screen. The audience, too, became a chorus that extended the film's meaning. Their laughter at impossible stunts, their tears at echoes of Walker's legacy, their debates over physics and continuity. These reactions transformed Fast X into a shared experience. It became a film less about cars and more about community. Some mocked it, some worshipped it. But in both responses, it was investment. Proof that the saga still knows how to capture attention, provoke conversation, and stir emotion. And in that, there is victory. What fascinates me is how the saga has embraced contradiction as its lifeblood. It is at once ridiculous and profound, absurd and sincere. A car can defy gravity, and yet the grief of a character can anchor us in reality. A villain can giggle through carnage, and yet we shiver at the cruelty hidden in the laughter. A word like family, repeated so often it risks parody, can suddenly strike us with genuine force in the quiet of a climactic moment. This is not failure. It is alchemy, the ability to transform exaggeration into emotion, to turn implausibility into myth. When I think of Fast X, I do not think only of the stunts or the plot twists, though they certainly linger in memory. I think of the way Diesel's eyes softened when he spoke of Walker, the way Rodriguez smirked at the absurdity of her own fight sequences, The way Momoa reveled in chaos as if it were performance art. I think of audiences who came prepared to scoff and ended up caring, who mocked the illogic and then found themselves, almost against their will, invested in the fates of characters they had known for 2 decades. These are the textures that remain, the fibers of memory that cling long after the spectacle fades. The conclusion of any review is meant to tie together threads, to make sense of what has been said. But perhaps the truest conclusion here is that Fast X resists neat packaging. It is too sprawling, too chaotic, too earnest in its contradictions. And maybe that is precisely why it endures, because it does not apologize for its excess, because it dares to be more than reasonable, because it insists that cinema at its heart is about feeling rather than logic. We do not watch these films to measure probability. We watch them to believe, if only for a moment, that loyalty can conquer fate, that engines can defy gravity, that love and loss can echo in the most unexpected places. There is also something deeply literary in this saga. Despite its veneer of action, epics have always relied on repetition, on themes returning like refrains in poetry. Family becomes a refrain here, not unlike the repeated invocations in classical literature. The heroes return, the villains reappear, betrayals and reconciliations cycle endlessly, and yet each retelling deepens mythology rather than exhausting it. To dismiss it as mere popcorn cinema is to miss how modern myths are crafted, through exaggeration, through spectacle, through the persistence of themes that root themselves in the collective imagination. And so, as this chapter closes, one cannot help but feel a mixture of awe and amusement, reverence and irreverence. Fast X may not be perfect. In truth, it is gloriously imperfect. But perfection was never the point. The point was to create a world where audiences could gather, laugh, cry, and remember together. The point was to keep a promise, that the saga would continue, that the absence of Walker would not mean the death of the family, that stories could still roar forward even when loss threatened to silence them. In this, the film succeeds beyond measure. As I sit with the echoes of the film, I think not only of the movie itself, but of the conversations that surround it. I think of the audience in a darkened theater, gasping in unison. I think of the cast, their laughter spilling into interviews. I think of critics, torn between ridicule and respect. I think of memes, tweets, essays, and casual chats among friends. This is a life of cinema, not confined to the screen, but alive in the voices it ignites. And perhaps that is a true conclusion, that a film lives as long as people continue to speak of it, to argue about it, to carry it forward in memory and story. To those of you who have traveled with me through this reflection, who have shared in this exploration, not only of a film, but of the culture surrounding it, I offer gratitude. It has been less a review and more a conversation, less an analysis and more a journey into the heart of what it means to watch, to feel, to remember. And if you have found yourself stirred even a little by this exploration, if you have laughed at its absurdities or paused at its echoes of grief or marveled at its stubborn refusal to obey gravity, I invite you to continue with me. Cinema is not meant to be consumed in isolation. It is meant to be shared, discussed, cherished. Here at Cinema Vault, that is the promise, that we will continue to dive deep, to treat film not as distraction, but as literature in motion, as myth unfolding on screen. So stay with me. Subscribe if you haven't, not out of obligation, but because you, too, are part of this family of reflection. Share these stories. Leave your thoughts. Bring your voice into the chorus. Because in the end, cinema is not made by filmmakers alone. It is completed by those who watch, who feel, who carry the light of story forward into their own lives. And in that sense, Fast X belongs not only to its cast or its creators, but to all of us who for a few fleeting hours chose to believe in the impossible, and in doing so, discovered something profoundly human.